In K-pop there have always been small groups, mid-tier groups and big groups. It's nothing new and this has been a thing since the first generation, but the market has gone through more and more changes in these last couple of years, and now the disparity between big and small groups has increased like never before, to the point that most groups outside of the big four struggle to survive unless they happen to get very lucky and have a viral song or unless they have an already famous member that helps them gaining initial attention. But most non-big four groups can't compete with big groups at all. We shouldn't blindly hate big companies just because they got big, because that is just business, and we shouldn't blame their artists either because it's not their fault. But we can't deny that we are living in an era where everything seems to be controlled by big companies. However, things didn't always used to be like this, so before talking about what K-pop's future might be, let's first take a look at the past. In second gen there were a lot of non-big three groups that did just as well as big three ones if not better. Some examples include T-ara, Sistar, 4 Minute, Infinite, VIX, Block B, Beast, AOA, Kara, Girls' Day, After School, Lovelies, BAP and Hey Pink. All these groups were serious competition even for big company groups like Miss A, 2NE1, TVXQ, Girls' Generation and many more. Despite coming from smaller mid-sized companies, they were still able to reach a level of success that they could only dream about if they debuted now. You best believe that nowadays these groups would be pretty underrated. I'm convinced that small groups of today would have been mid-tier groups if they debuted in second gen, because back then it was much easier for every group to achieve the mid-tier level. It was easier to grow, and this was mainly because of a couple of reasons. First of all, the big three weren't as solidified as now. Of course they were the biggest companies, but back then, it felt like any other relatively successful company could have a shot at taking the place of one of the big three. Just think about the fact that in first-gen DSP media was literally dominating K-pop with its artists, and it continued to do so even in the beginning of second-gen. So what I'm saying is that the big three were definitely not as solidified as they are now, and their relevancy in the industry was still building, so there was still a chance for someone else to take the spotlight. But the main reason as to why it was easier to make it big back then is because big companies only debut groups every few years. The market was still oversaturated, but it wasn't oversaturated with big three groups, so everyone who debuted had an equal chance to succeed. Nowadays, on the other hand, big companies are debuting groups pretty much every year, mostly Hype, who own several sub-labels. And now with every big four group that debuts, the chances of small and mid-sized groups to find success decrease even faster. In conclusion, in second gen it overall felt like everybody had a bigger chance to make it, because the foundation of the industry as we know it had just started to form. Back then it felt like anything could have happened, but things started to change as we progressed into the following generation. Third gen was kind of like a transition where we saw the number of successful non-big three groups decreasing, but there were still quite a few groups that stood strong. For example, EXID, Mamamoo, Oh My Girl, Astro, Monster X and SF9. We also had survival show groups like Wanna and IOI who gained huge success, even if survival shows only made the industry become even more competitive and saturated. But let's go back to talking about companies. By third gen the big three were pretty solidified and it felt impossible to even think about another company potentially taking their place. Second gen groups had already established their legacies and their juniors only made it bigger, cementing JYP, YG and SM as the biggest companies in K-pop, something that made it possible for the company's fame to easily transfer to every new group debuting under that company. And as big companies solidified their position and built a legacy for themselves, more and more people became company stans, drawn by each company's style and sound and willing to support every group from the agency, which also made them less willing to explore other companies and other groups. In fact, in third gen people really started becoming less multi-fandom. The competitive nature of the industry with its streaming culture made people view K-pop as a competition instead of just a music genre. K-pop stans no longer stan groups just for their music and the members' personalities. They started standing them for their achievements, and as everything became a competition, K-pop stans became more competitive themselves, refusing to give a chance to other groups outside of their faves and only focusing on successful groups that they could brag about. Last but not least, big companies' content was always more accessible as they had bigger resources and more money to invest in their artists. So the more accessible content is, the less you have to look around to find other groups to stan. If we're constantly being bombarded with such accessible content from big companies, then why would we need to go and search for less quality content from an unknown agency? And as more and more content comes out, we have more things to watch and less time to do it, which is one more reason as to why people started to only focus on their faves instead of branching out and exploring K-pop thoroughly. Of course, we can't really have a proper discussion without mentioning the exceptions. For example, small companies with underrated groups that ended up becoming huge. Just look at Big Hit with BTS. And then we can also talk about groups from mid-sized companies that are sometimes even more successful than Big 4 artists. I'm talking about G-Idol and IVE. Another exception could be 50/50, who came from an unknown company and had one of the biggest worldwide hits of the decade. These exceptions will always exist, but they will always be just exceptions, just anomalies. Back in second gen you had plenty of groups like G-Idol and IVE, plenty of groups from mid-tier companies who could rival big 3 groups, but now you only really have these two. And back in second gen there was still a way for a new company to grow and become one of the biggest agencies, just like what happened with Big Hit. But now that's just impossible. The market is dominated by the Big 4 and there is no place for another company. There will never be such thing as the Big 5. So what I'm trying to say is that those that today are just exceptions, back then were still something relatively normal. But now we are starting to see how unlikely it's becoming to make it big if you're not from a big company. And the thing is, it's still very much possible to receive attention and go viral even if you're a small group. But it's extremely hard to maintain that attention and solidify yourself enough to reach the same level of big company groups. So with that being said, what will be the future of K-pop? Well, I think there are still gonna be relatively successful groups from smaller companies, not just the ones I mentioned before but also groups like Stacy, 80s and groups from survival shows like Zero Base One and Kepler. But in the future they will have even less of a chance to compete with big company groups. Most of these successful non-Big 4 groups will either get lucky and have songs go viral, or they will need to at least have an already popular member debuting in them to receive attention. They will be especially lucky if they get formed through an Mnet survival show, because that is gonna give them some pre-debut clout. But it's still gonna be hard considering how many Big 4 groups are debuting each year. I feel like in the future small companies will feel even more discouraged to try and debut groups because of how competitive the industry will keep on getting. And if small companies fail in trying to make their groups gain success, they will just disband them extremely soon. In the future small companies will just give up. Several of these companies will shut down and basically no one will even try to open up a new company unless they already have ties to bigger companies or famous producers and artists. People are starting to lose hope, and I don't think there are going to be many who are willing to invest in opening a new company. Big company monopoly is pretty much an inevitable process, and what we are witnessing today is something that was bound to happen from the very beginning, from the very start of K-pop. It took some time, but now it's too late to reverse the process. Big companies are not evil for building this monopoly. They just did what any company tries to do to gain money and relevancy. This is how business works, and it makes no sense to just consider them as villains. But sometimes it can be sad seeing where the industry is going and realizing there might not be a future for non-Big 4 artists. In conclusion, we are now fully entering the big company monopoly era. Maybe I'm wrong, who knows? But what's for sure is that nobody has a chance to make it if things keep on going the way they're going. Non-Big 4 K-pop is dying. The Big 4 are killing the competition more and more each day, and soon there will be no space left for anyone else. I hope I'm wrong, but we'll see. Anyway, what do you guys think? Are you also noticing this dramatic shift in the industry or not? Tell me in the comments. Thanks for watching till the end. Bye guys.